So you have finally launched your Next.js project and you're actually getting a few users. Things are looking great. But then the inevitable happens. You realize your application is exposing sensitive data, it's painfully slow, and it's breaking user experience. And all of this because of authentication mistakes.
No! God, please, no! No!
These mistakes don't only cost you users, but they make your application slow and unusable. But don't worry, in this video I will show you all of the authentication mistakes that you make in your application, and of course I will show you how to fix them.
Nice.
And now let's make your application secure, fast and bulletproof. Let's go! Alright, so right here I have created a little Next.js project, and in the navbar you see I have created a few pages. Now each route which is prefixed with auth should only be available or accessible to authenticated users. But here's the thing, I'm not authenticated, I don't have a valid session, but I'm still able to view these pages. So what we want to do is first of all implement authentication, and once we have authentication, I can show you the authentication mistakes that you make in your application every day. And for authentication we will use Taint. Taint is a channel sponsor and my favorite auth solution. Nevertheless, this video is not dependent on Taint. This means if you use a different auth solution you can still follow the video. The logic will be the same, but the code will differ a bit. Nevertheless, Taint is my favorite auth solution. They offer a lot of features, authentication, authorization, feature flags, billing soon, and much more. And the pricing is also great with a very generous free tier. But now you know what Taint is, and now we can implement Taint. And you know what? Let's do a speed one. Let's implement Taint in 1 minute or so. And the first step is to sign in. The next step is to create a business with a business name, Taint domain, number of employees, and region. Once our business is created, we want to use Taint with our code base, we want to use Next.js, and for authentication we want to use Google, and let's use GitHub. Now we are almost finished, we want to connect our codebase with Taint, so let's install the Next.js SDK. Once the SDK is installed, we can copy our environment variables and paste them in the env file. These environment variables store the client ID, client secret, issuer URL, and a few other core secrets. As a next step, let's create our API endpoint. So let's copy the folder structure, let's go back in the app folder, and let's create a new folder. So now we have created our route handler in the API folder, auth folder, Taint auth folder, and then we have the route.ts. This means I can copy this code and paste it inside of here. This route handler is there to allow the user to log in, log out, and authenticate with the social providers. The last step is to set up the Taint auth provider, and this will give you access to the Taint auth data in your whole application, and tokens will be refreshed when needed. So let's copy the code, let's paste it in an auth provider file. This is marked as use client, and now we can take this auth provider and we can render it in the layout. This means we want to wrap our whole application inside of our auth provider. Once we have done that, we are actually finished. Now we can use the register link and login link and authenticate our user. So for that, I can copy first of all the import statement. Let's go in the navbar, let's paste the import statement, and instead of rendering a button, let's get the register link, and let's also get right here the login link. And these two components are headless, so let's give them a class name of button variants. This means we style this component like a shared CN button. So now we can restart our dev server, let's go back and let's finally register. As you see, I got redirected to the Taint auth page, and I can now authenticate with Google. As you now see, I got redirected back to our application, and now I have a valid session. Nevertheless, on the top right corner, I still show the register and login button. So what I want to now do is go to our navbar, I want to get our session and then render a ternary. So what we can do is use the get Taint server session hook, and we can destructure get user. Get user is a function which we have to await since it's a promise, and this one's on the server side. And since we now get our user session, we can do a ternary and check if we have a valid session. So let's create our ternary and let's say, hey, If we have a user, let's render the logout link component from kind to logout, and if not, if we don't have a valid session, let's render the register and login link component. If I go back, we now have our logout, and if I click on the button, we will of course log out and get redirected to our index page. So now we have implemented authentication, and here comes my question to you. How would you make sure that only authenticated users are able to view these pages? This means the pages which are prefixed with auth. Well, one solution would actually be to create a route group. This means in the app folder, I have a protected folder. This is a route group, and this means that this folder is not mapped to the URL. Blog has its own URL, dashboard has its own URL, and about has its own URL. And then in this route group, we can create a layout file. And this layout file, at the end of the day, renders our children. And as children, we have the about route, the blog route, and the dashboard route. So this is the standard layout file. And what most people would do right here is first of all fetch the user session. So we can get our user function from getKindServerSession, our hook, and then we can do a if check, and we can say, hey, if there's no user, this means if we don't have any valid user session, then let's redirect the user to our index page. Let's now save this, let's go back, and let's do a hard refresh. As you see, everything still works, but that's because I have a valid session. I'm now logged out, and if I try to reach the about route, I will get redirected. If I try to reach the blog route, I will get redirected. And now you might say, hey, this is great. I don't have to do anything. I can just do an if check in the layout, and then we're good to go. But you know what? This if check in the layout actually creates a lot of problems. And the first issue is that actually a layout does not re-render. So let's go to our blog route. If I do a hard refresh, our whole page loads. This means our layout renders and then our children render, or in this case, our blog child renders. This is relatively cool because in the layout, we now make sure that the user is authenticated. But if I now create a link in the blog and give it an href of dashboard, we will do a client-side navigation to the dashboard. Now this is all fine, it's fast, it's cool, but the problem is the layout does not re-render. And this means that this page in theory is not protected anymore. And you know what, I can show it to you. Let's open our inspector, let's go to the network, let's again go to our blog route, let's do a hard refresh, and inside of here, you see all of our fetch requests. And one thing which you'll see is the layout.js right here. And this means that we first of all initialize our layout file, and after that we initialize our page.tsx. But if I now click on create post, you see there is no layout file anymore right here. We don't fetch the layout file anymore. We don't check a valid session anymore. We just get our dashboard content. This is a React server component, but we don't check that the user is actually authenticated. And that's a big problem because again, we don't re-render the layout. We don't check that the user has a valid session, which means that this route is pretty much not authenticated anymore. And this is not what you want. But now you might say, hey Jan, there's a fix. Instead of doing the authentication check in the layout, let's do the authentication check in the individual routes. And you know what? This is a valid suggestion. So if we go to the layout, we can copy our authentication check. Let's copy it. Let's delete it from here. And then, for example, in our blog route, we can paste it inside of here. Let's also do the same for our about route and also for our dashboard. Now, it's very important that you mark the function as async because this is now a server component. And again, don't forget to delete it from the layout because it's not needed anymore inside of here. If we now again go back, you see everything still works. And let's log out and let's see if it still works. So if I try to reach the dashboard route, I will get redirected. If I try to reach the about route, I will get redirected. And the same is true for the blog. So this is great. We don't have any problems with not re-rendered layouts anymore. Each route is protected and that's what we wanted. This means if we do in client-side navigation, we will still check that the user has a valid session. But there's one problem right now. If I go, for example, to the about route and for some reason I mark this as use client because I want to, for example, use the use state hook or something like that, then this won't work. So if I go to about, we get an error. So what we would have to do is create a separate component, then throw the code inside of there, mark it as use client. And this is annoying, this takes too much time. I don't want to do that. So how can we still protect all of our routes but still have the ability to mark the page as use client because we need some sort of interactivity? Well, believe it or not, there's a simple fix, and this is middleware. So middleware allows you to run code before a request is completed. So if you don't know about middleware, it's like a layer before your handler, and your handler in this case is your page, your server component, a route handler, a server action, whatever. And what we do is we make a request to our page, right? And the middleware layer is in front of our page. So we do the request, the middleware pretty much intercepts the request and then does some sort of check. In this case, we want to check that the user has a valid session. So we would check, hey, has the user a valid session? If yes, we would then just continue the request and pretty much redirect the user to the handler, to the page, to the server action, whatever. But if the user does not have a valid session, then we will just respond and we will redirect the user to the index page, to the login route, whatever. And again, if everything is fine, we just continue, we will redirect the user to the handler will do whatever the handler needs to do, and we will return the response back to the client. And one thing which I also mentioned right here is that this middleware runs on the Edge environment. And the Edge environment is super fast and it's distributed around the world. So if your user is in Africa, then this middleware will run in Africa. If your user is in the US, then the middleware will run in the US. So this means this is super fast, and actually it's also super simple to implement with kind. So right here in the documentation, they have a code example on how to run kind with middleware. We can copy this code example, then in our root directory, we can create a middleware.ts file, and let's paste the code inside of here. So right here we do an export default function middleware, and we do a return with auth. This means at the end of the day right now, we protect all routes. But this is not what we want, because if I save this and go back and try to reach our index page, we will get redirected to our authentication page. But our index page is a public route. So what we want to do is create a matcher. And this matcher tells the middleware what routes it should protect. And we want to protect our dashboard route, we want to protect our block route and our about route. And if I now save this and go back and try to reach my index page, everything still works. And this now means I can go to my about route and I can delete my authentication check. I can delete the import statement and we don't have to mark this as async anymore. Let's do the same for the dashboard and for the block. So now I have deleted our authentication checks from our individual routes, and now we only have our middleware. And if I again go back and try to reach our block route, I will get redirected to authenticate right here. Isn't that great? So now middleware intercepts our request right here, and then it redirects the user to our authentication page. But if the user is authenticated, then we just continue the response or the request, and we let the user redirect to the actual destination. So for example, to the about route. So as you now see, I'm logged in and I'm able to reach the about route, the dashboard route and the block route. But now there's a problem which I haven't talked about. So in the about page, I don't fetch any data. In the dashboard page, I don't fetch any data. This means these two pages should be static, right? But what if I told you that these pages are actually currently rendered dynamically? Well, let's open our terminal, let's stop the dev server, and let's run pnpm run build. This is the build command, and this will create a optimized production build. Inside of here, you'll now see something interesting. We have a table, and this table tells us what routes are server rendered, this means dynamically rendered, and what routes are rendered statically. And all routes have an F in front of them. This means they are all rendered dynamically. But this shouldn't happen, because at the end of the day, we use middleware, and middleware actually preserves static content. This means the about route and also the dashboard route, both of these routes should be rendered statically. And statically means that your content, your page is pre-rendered and then served using a CDN. So what's exactly the problem? Well, the problem is relatively simple, and that's our navbar. In the navbar, we use the getKind server session hook. This hook runs on the server side, or in other words, the function. And this function calls headers. And when it does that, it automatically opts into dynamic rendering. And this navbar is rendered in our layout, which means all of our children are opted into dynamic rendering. And that's not what you want. So instead of using the getKind server session hook, we can use the useKind browser client hook. And then this isn't a promise anymore. Let's delete the async and let's mark this as useClient. So this now runs completely on the client side, which means we don't call any headers, cookies or anything like that. If I now open my terminal and again rerun pnpm run build, you'll now see that we will have static content. So as you now see, I've created my optimized production build, and then in our actual table you see our index page, our about route, our block route, our dashboard. All of these pages are actually static, meaning pre-rendered as static content. They are pre-rendered when you build the application and then served using a CDN, which means they are super fast. And then for example, our API route is dynamically rendered, but that's fine. An API route can't be static. It has to be server rendered on demand. And now let's again recap what's the benefit of middleware. Well, first of all, middleware is very easy to implement. So if we go to the middleware file, you see it's super easy to implement. Secondly, it's super fast because it runs on the Edge environment and the Edge environment is distributed globally. And thirdly, or the third benefit, is that actually we centralize our redirect logic. This means the code right here is the same for each page. Because if you go, for example, to the dashboard page, you could write one authentication logic and then in the block route, you could write something else. With the middleware file, we centralize everything. And the fourth benefit is, if you use middleware, you preserve static content. Because if you go to the block route and then create right here our if check, so you would first of all fetch our user and then you would do an if check. If you do that, you automatically right here opt into dynamic rendering. And when this page is rendered dynamically, the whole experience will get worse. Why? Because it will take a longer time to actually see something. The request first of all has to go to the server has to generate the HTML and then send it back. This takes a lot of time, and that's why you want to always use static rendering if you are able to. And in the block route, in the dashboard route, and also in the about route, we are able to, and that's the nice thing with middleware. We allow static content to be rendered and generated. Okay, so now we have talked quite a bit about middleware and how we can protect our routes. But what is if I tell you that I'm right now actually leaking user data to the client side? So right here in the dashboard, I'm currently rendering my name, Jan. And if we go to the dashboard, you'll see I'm currently fetching my user. This user, which I get returned from kind, is a object, and in the object we have the username, email, ID, last name, image, stuff like that. And what I do right here is that I pass this user object to the user card component. And the user card is just a standard component. We get our user through our params, and then we just pass it right here. So we return the given name. And if I go back, I render my name. But this is a big problem. This is marked as useClient. And this component gets all the user data. This means the ID, the email, everything that I don't want to leak. And because we mark this as useClient, we actually leak everything to the client side. And that's not what we want to do. We want to only pass the given name to the client component and not the whole user object with all of this private info. So to prevent leaking sensitive data to the client side, you can use the experimental React Taint API. So we can go to the next.config file. Then inside of here, we can get our experimental flag and set Taint as true. And if we go back to our page.tsx, we can actually import it right here. So experimental Taint object reference from React. And then underneath our constant user, I can call experimental Taint object reference. Then I can pass a error message. And as a second argument, I can pass my user object. And if I now save this and actually go back, you'll see that we will get an error. So right here it now says, do not pass user data to the client. So this experimental Taint object reference is a new feature in Next.js. Currently it's experimental, but I have already been using it for quite some time and it's super cool. So if you use it, you can actually prevent objects, sensitive data to be passed to the client side. Because you see underneath this actual call, I pass my data, but this one's before actually passing the data, meaning that we throw an error. And now as a user, I could see, hey, okay, we have different problem. Maybe let's not pass the actual object, let's pass the user.givenName, and then this will be enough. And as you see, if I modify the user card where I say I only get a user which is of type string and then pass the user given name, I don't get any error anymore. And that's because I don't actually pass any object anymore, but only a specific field. And with that, I make sure that I don't pass any data which shouldn't be passed to the client side, like the ID, email, and everything like that. Let's now continue with our next issue, and this issue deals with server actions and actually not protecting server actions. So right here in the dashboard we have our form with the title and the content. I can pass a title and some content, and if I click on create, we create a mutation, or in other words, we create a block article and we redirect the user. For this magic we use a server action. This means we mark this file as used server, and then we create our export async function, create post, we get the title, we get the content from our form data, and then I do the mutation with Prisma. After the mutation, I revalidate my block. This means I want to revalidate the cache and get the newest articles, and I redirect the user to the block page. Relatively standard code. In the page.tsx we have a form with the action and then the submit button, of course, and then the inputs for the title and the content. And now you might ask me, hey Jan, this looks relatively standard, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that Next.js, when you use a server action, exposes a public endpoint. So in the documentation right at the end, as you see, they mention by default when a server action is created and exported, it creates a public HTTP endpoint. I can show it to you. If we go to the inspector and to the network, I can create a mutation. And if I click on create, you see, dashboard. So we have right here a fetch request, and this is a post request. What does this mean? Well, this means this is a public endpoint with this request URL. And if you scroll a bit to the bottom, you will find a next action ID. And if you copy this action ID, you will be able to go to Postman and create a post request to this dashboard while not even being authenticated. And that's not what we want. So what we have to do is also check inside of our server action that the user is authenticated. And since the server action runs on the server side, we can use our getKind server session, get our user, and then we can do an if check and we can say, hey, if there's no user, let's redirect the user to the login route. And this runs before the mutation. So if there's no valid session, then we won't even do the mutation. And with this, we now make sure that only authenticated users are able to create a mutation right here. Because again, if you have a public endpoint, anyone could actually submit the form without being authenticated. But if we do a authentication check in the server action, then only authenticated users will be able to submit the form, and that's exactly what we want. Let's now continue with the next issue. So I'm again in my dashboard page, and what I now do is a constant data await get user. I have created a hooks file, and in this hooks file I have just an export async function get user, and in this function I use Prisma to get all of my users. So a prisma.user.findMany, and then at the end I return my data. And then in the page.tsx, since this is a server component, I can just do an await get user, and then this Prisma fetch call will run. And right now there's nothing wrong with this actual code, because if I go back to the dashboard, this dashboard is protected by our middleware. This means only authenticated users will be able to get this data. But here comes the problem. What is if I go to my middleware and for some reason I delete the dashboard from the matcher? Now I don't authenticate this page anymore. But this isn't a big issue, right? Because at the end of the day, the mutation is still safe. Only authenticated users are able to create a post. Yes, the mutation is safe. But what is about this data fetching that we do? This data fetching is not authenticated anymore. And all of that because we did a silly mistake where we deleted the dashboard route from our matcher. This shouldn't happen. This is a silly mistake which can happen very easily, and with that we can leak super sensitive data, and that's something that you want to never do. So here comes the fix. And the fix is close proximity checks. So when you fetch data from a different layer, from a different file, you want to actually do authentication checks in the specific fetch call. In this case, above our constant data, we want to make sure that the user is first of all authenticated, and if not, we will redirect the user. And close proximity just means that at the end of the day, you want to keep your authentication checks as close as possible to your data. And what's exactly the benefit of this close proximity auth check? Well, at the end of the day, you have double security, because you will first of all have your middleware, and this will be your security check number 1. But if it fails, like right here, we will have security check number 2, and this will be in the get user function, because inside of here, we will again check that the user is authenticated. So for example, if I again comment out this check right here and go back and do a hard refresh, you will see that I'm still able to view the dashboard route. I'm not able to create a mutation, but I'm able to see this page, and in this sense, I'm also able to view this sensitive data. But if I again comment this out and go back and try to reach the dashboard route, you see I will get redirected back to the index page. So this is your close proximity auth check. It's super important, and this is something which I would always recommend. So what I would do is first of all always create a function which only deals with the session check. So right here I have a function require session, and this function only checks if the user has a valid session. So right here I use the isAuthenticated function. IsAuthenticated returns a boolean, either true or false. If the user has a valid session, true. If not, false. If not, I redirect the user, and then at the end I return the boolean. This means true. So now I have this require user function, and what I would do is always call this function whenever I fetch data. So in this get user function, instead of for example doing this manual get user then if check, I would instead always call constant session equals to await require session. So with that we have our close proximity auth check, and we also use a reusable function which we can use in multiple places. This first of all makes your code super clean, but secondly it also makes your code super secure, because we now have our middleware layer and our actual request layer, if this makes sense. So to end off this video, I have created a graph on how I would actually implement authentication in my application. And what I would do is multi-layered authentication, meaning I would actually implement auth checks as much as I can in my application. So let's start from the top. I would start with an empty application. No authentication, no auth checks. As in first step, I would create middleware. Now here's the thing. Middleware runs on the edge environment, or in the edge environment, I'm not sure. This is great because it's fast and global, meaning you have servers around the world. But here's the problem, it's the edge, meaning the V8 runtime. Not everything works on the edge environment. Prisma, Drizzle, the most common ORMs work on the edge environment, meaning you should be able to implement middleware. Nevertheless, there might be cases where middleware won't work. So what I would say is, if you have the ability, please implement middleware. If not, then I would continue with an auth check on the page level. So as you saw at the start, we had our individual pages and we did an auth check in the individual page. The great thing is that each page is now authenticated. The disadvantage is that at the end of the day, we don't have any static rendering anymore. Because if we use middleware, we preserve static rendering. If we use an auth check on the page level, then we lose the static rendering because we automatically opt into dynamic rendering. So if you're able to, middleware will make your application faster. Then as a next step, I would also implement auth check in query, meaning I would implement close proximity auth checks. As you saw in the example, it's very easy to forget to add a route to your matcher, meaning you always want to have double layered security. And if we use close proximity auth checks, our data layer is right next to our auth layer, meaning whenever we fetch data, we always guarantee that the user has a valid session and is authorized to view this data. And then as a last step, if I use server actions, I would also of course add again a auth check, because a server action is a public endpoint. You want to only allow authenticated users to actually create a mutation. And that's how multi-layered authentication works, or multi-layered auth checks work. At the end of the day, we have multiple checks and if everything passes, we grant access. If one of these checks fails, then we deny access. Now, should you implement all of these in your application? Maybe not. What I would do is first of all implement middleware. That's something I would do 100%. Auth checks on the page level. This is debatable. You could add it, but you don't have to add it. What I would rather do is 100% add auth check in query, because this close proximity guarantees that the user is authenticated. Server actions should also always be authenticated. And with that, you will have a super secure authentication system in your application, and no malicious user will be able to do anything with your application. So yeah, everyone, this was the video. Thank you for watching the video. Thank you, Kind, for making this video possible. If you want to check out Kind, click on the first link in the YouTube description. And now, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. This would mean a lot to me and to my heart and to everyone around me, I guess. So yeah, I hope you enjoy your day. I hope I can see you in the next video. Enjoy New Year, because in a few days we have already 2025. And now yeah, enjoy your day and bye. Damn dude, it's like, what date is it today? It's the 28th. The 31st is in a few days. We will have 2025. Isn't that mad? Man, 2024 was so quick. Okay, yeah, bye. I will cry in a second. Okay, who cares? Bye bye.